Absolutely.
Thank you. So thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon for today's webinar. This is a monthly webinar series organized by the Global and International Engagement Unit at the School of Education. We welcome you all, and we welcome also Professor Stacy Maroney, Dean of the School of Education, who's in the audience. Thank you for joining us as well. The webinar will take the form of 30 minutes of conversation between our guest speakers, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers. So in the meantime, if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A section of this webinar. Along with Dean Maroney, our guests today are two people who've been the heart and soul of the School of Education for quite some time. They are Dean Emeritus Gerardo González and Executive Associate Dean Vasti Torres. Together, they will engage us in a conversation about Dean González's account of his journeys in Cuba and to the United States, and his struggles as a youth coming from Cuba to this country, and then of his return visit 50 years later. The discussions will be based on Dean González's memoir, A Cuban Refugee's Journey to the American Dream, The Power of Education. Dean González and Dean Torres, welcome to our webinar. Please take it away.
Thank you, Farida. I want to thank Farida and the Global International Engagement Office for doing this webinar as part of Latinx Heritage Month. It's important to acknowledge the intersections between international and those of us who are in the United States from other countries. As I read your memoirs, I found that we have even more things in common than I thought. Of course, we are both immigrants from Cuba. We have both been back and led study tours for alumni associations. But I also found out that both of our paternal grandfathers were seasonal workers in the Cuban sugar mill industry. So that was kind of interesting. And I'm really curious for another conversation that your mother's maiden name was Torres. So I'm wondering if we're actually related in some way.
That's right.
So, but those of you who don't know, Torres is a very common Spanish name. So it's probably not the case.
Vasti, let me say before we launch into the questions, first to thank Farida and Dean Maroney and you for hosting this and for the invitation to participate. And the other thing I wanted to do is quickly respond to your observation that we have the same last name, or my mother's maiden last name. And of course, as you know, Cuba is an island, and so it's very possible everybody there is related in some way. So nice to be with you, and look forward to our conversation. Welcome to the audience as well.
Thank you. I'm going to start by saying, as I read your book, I really appreciated the level of vulnerability that one has to express when writing the memoirs. And though you want to encourage others as you wrote this book, some of the stories you tell were personally painful for you. I wonder if you could talk about how you came to the point where you were willing to share your story.
Well, the original motivation for me to want to write the memoir in the first place was really an emotional experience. So the genesis is in feelings and memories and emotions that I had when I returned to Cuba for the first time 50 years, almost to the date, after I had left in 1962 as a young child. And I was going there as host for a program sponsored by the Indiana University Alumni Association at the time that relationships between the US and Cuba were just beginning to be normalized and emerge. Eventually, diplomatic relationships were established, but in 2012, the year that I went back for the first time, there still were not diplomatic relations between the US and Cuba. For a long time, I had thought about one day going back, but frankly, I was so busy attending to my responsibilities and just getting by that I never made the effort to intentionally arrange a meeting. So when the IUAA called me and asked me to do this, I checked my calendar and realized that I was able to do this, and I was very excited to do it. What I did not expect, though, was the reaction that I had to all of a sudden touching Cuban ground for the very first time. Even before the plane landed, as the plane was approaching the runway in Havana, and I began to see the royal palm trees, which are the native tree of Cuba, I began to feel a little choked up. But when we landed and I saw the airport and the people and so forth, memories and feelings that I had long forgotten began to come back. And some of those feelings were of ordeals that my families went through. Some of it were related to stories that I heard from my parents all along growing up. Some things were just things that I had forgotten, and all of a sudden, there they were in front of me. And so that trip was intensely emotional and led to me wanting to have more conversations with my parents about what were the reasons they decided to leave their home, their families, and come to the United States. And the answer that kept coming back was, well, we did it for you, for los hijos, the children. And as I spoke with my mother and my father, I gained a deeper understanding of not only what it was like for them, but how fortunate I was to now be able to enjoy the kind of lifestyle that I have and the freedoms that this country affords us, and began to want to write about that. And in the process of doing that, I reflected on the experiences that I had along the way, including some very difficult experiences in the schools after I came here as a non-English speaker, experiences that I had of discrimination and the like, because Cubans were not always welcome in this country. And I began to reflect on what have I learned from all of that. And as the writing progressed and it evolved, the memoir that was eventually published took place. And so it is a story. I've always enjoyed, telling stories. I think stories are powerful ways to influence people or to make a point. But it also, the book reflects my own reflections on how did all this impact me? And so it's a combination of my own personal trials and tribulations, my parents' ordeals of trying to find work and just the immigration experience, and what have I learned as a result of all that, and what made the difference in my life. And of course, it came down to education. I'm the first in my family to attend college. I was not even prepared for college, really in high school. And so I wanted to share those lessons in a way that was part of the story, rather than just give advice. I was simply saying, here's what I learned, without having to say, here's what I learned. And I always hope that it would have value beyond me just telling my personal history and stories, but that the reader could kind of put themselves in the story, if you will, or at least gain a better understanding of what not just my family and I, but the immigrant experiences like.
Yeah. The first time I went back to Cuba, my parents actually asked me to accompany them. And I remember feeling it was a cultural encounter. Even though I have a very strong identity as a Cuban, it was very different visiting and being there physically. And so I certainly understand. I was also surprised how many things I remembered, which was, I can certainly relate to that feeling. So before we continue, I want to make sure that the audience knows, please feel free to type in questions. We will be able to see them. If they relate to what we're talking about, we can pull them in, or if not, we can do them at the question and answer session at the end. So kind of do that. I want to talk a little bit about the way you talk about what is currently happening in the United States and issues around immigration in the United States. And you know, while certain things are certainly better, you also occupy that space of what W.E.B. Du Bois called that double consciousness, being in between two sets of cultures. How would you like to see things changed? And how could we remove barriers that may still exist for immigrants in the United States?
Well, I think that it may be a pipe dream given the political climate that we unfortunately are confronting in this country today. But if I was to say, what would be the most important thing that I would like to see to help address the immigration crisis and sort of change for the better the experience of immigrants as a whole, I would say that it would be for the United States Congress and the president to eventually get together and agree on some reasonable immigration policy. It is a challenge that has not been met by successive administrations. And I'll give you a few examples of things that, to my way of thinking, and I think most reasonable people would say that makes sense. The DACA program, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, is a program for young children who were brought here to this country illegally, in most cases, maybe in every case, but they are in every respect Americans. They grew up here. They have done well because DACA requires students, in order to qualify, that they have not committed crimes, that they have attended high school if they're that age, and so forth. And there are hundreds of thousands of students who qualify. In fact, at one point, it was 800,000. And when that happened, I was just so happy that at least that slice of the population will be given an opportunity. These students, if they were deported, they will go into a country that they know very little about, except the stories maybe their parents told or maybe their own reading. So in every respect, they're Americans. And it looked like that legislation that had been introduced by President Obama, I think in 2017, was moving forward. And then, of course, the administration changed in 2018, and President Trump reversed that decision, suspended the program, and gave Congress, I think it was 6 months to come to a resolution. Well, here we are now, another administration later, and 5 years or more since the reversal, and still no agreement on that back. In fact, within the last few weeks, things were moving through the courts. And all this young people who are a gift to this country. I mean, it's for them too, and the family to be able to be here. But in many ways, these are students who have so much promise, who can contribute to this country, and they're in limbo. Another element of policy that has not been addressed is the ability for even recent immigrants to work once they come to the United States. You know, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, from my own conversation with my parents, and then from immigrants that I've known throughout the years and everything that I read, if there's one thing that motivates immigrant parents to make the sacrifices that they have to make in order to come to this country and to bring their children to this country, is that they do it for their children. You know, imagine what it would be like, those of us who are now in professional roles or adults or any kind of responsibility, to at some point in your life, give up everything, your home, your parents, your neighborhood, your friends, everything that makes a person's life meaningful. And they're doing it for the children.
It is something that I think a feeling that every person who has been born outside of the United States shares. This notion of how much your family gives up, but also how much you gain from being in the United States.
So I get emotional just thinking about it, you know, talking about it for sure. But even this week, or the reason, you know, just the last few days, there's been some commentary about the Venezuelans who are coming to this country now to get away from an oppressive regime and also in search of opportunity for themselves, for their families. And they risk their lives to, you know, coming across the, what's it called? I made myself a note here, the Darien Gap, which is a very dangerous path between Colombia and Panama that they have to go walk across to get here. And if they make it to the US border, they are then given the opportunity to apply for asylum, although that just changed in the last couple of days, where some of them will be sent back to Mexico. But many of them have already entered the country. Well, the reason they're here is because they want to work. And some of them are very skilled people, but they're hard working. That one thing that holds the Latino community together is the family values, the work ethic, the family first, and kind of ethos that govern our experience. And so they want to go to work. That's what they make the sacrifice, so they can earn some money to pay for their own rent, to buy the children some clothes. If the children are not here, to send money back to the family. They're given the opportunity to apply for asylum, but they're not given a work permit. That makes absolutely no sense. So they become a public charge of no fault of their own, when they can easily be given the opportunity to work. And then finally, as a subset of policy, is this whole notion of financial aid for undocumented students who want to go to college or in-state tuition. Some states don't even allow undocumented students, even if they have the money, to pay in-state tuition. They treat them as out-of-state students. And you know how much that adds to the cost of an education in public college or university. So I would like to see all those things change. To me, it just makes sense, and it would improve this country. And somehow, because of the politics and the dynamics revolving immigration, we can't seem to solve even those things that seem simple, at least on the surface.
Yeah, in your book, you frame some of these issues around, like, we are basically reenacting history again and not learning from our history in the United States. So these are really important points to kind of think about. Before I ask you my next question, I want to kind of frame this a little bit. So in my 20s, I was in a master's program, and I attended a conference at the University of Florida, and you presented. And it was the first time that I had ever actually seen someone from my own background present at a national conference. And I actually walked up to you and introduced myself and just said it was really nice to see someone like you. When I came to IU and interviewed, I told you about this, and you go, okay, I don't remember. So I put this in context just to say that you have actually been a role model to me in many ways, even though you didn't realize it at the time. But when you talk about sort of the different processes you've been, you say that you want to be a role model for other Latinos, which I think you have been. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you have approached the role of mentoring throughout your career, because you've had different roles. And I gave you a hard time about the one time I introduced myself, but it was genuine. It was really meaningful for me to see someone that had my similar background presenting at a national conference.
Well, that's a very important experience for all of us who are looking for guidance or have dreams to see others like ourselves who are able to succeed. Before I answer your question more directly, I want to tell you, Vasti, that I grew up in the 1960s. I mean, I came of age in the 1960s, the days of the counter-revolution. And there was a saying in those days that I still vividly remember from time to time I invoke, and you just reminded me of it. And it's something like, if I remember, I wasn't there. so don't take it personal.
I didn't take it personal.
I'm glad that we met again and that you ended up accepting the offer to come to IU. Here you are now, as executive associate dean of the college. And so, yes, I do believe that mentoring is a very important function, if you will. Mentors were very important to me. As I mentioned a minute ago, I'm the first in my family to attend college. Well, my parents always impressed upon me the importance of education. And in the book, I talk about how my father, who was an auto mechanic, tried to motivate. He would just show me his hands. And, if you've seen the hands of a mechanic who's worked on engines for 40, 50 years, they take on a very distinctive look. He would put them in front of my face and say, mira, Hera, mira mis manos. Quiero que estudies para que cuando tú tengas mi edad, tus manos no estén como las mías. Look, Hera, look at my hands. I want you to study, get an education so that when you're my age, your hands don't look like mine. And, I had to navigate my way into college motivated by those kind of strong anecdotes and statements of what was important, but not because I understood what GREs are or GPAs or FAFSA or none of them. And they couldn't help me. And so it was through role modeling, starting with friends who had gone on to college, who were able to say, in a way, you can also do this. And then when I did get to college, faculty and others who took me under the wing of sorts, we learn in various ways, but I think one of the most powerful ways that we learn are by example. We vicariously see others perform. And the more the models look like us and sound like us, the more we internalize the lessons that they have to offer. Now, how have I translated that into my own style of modeling, if you will? I remember not that long ago, a few years ago, that I shared a stage at IU with the then Secretary of Education, Rod Page. And I was a little nervous, it's not every day that you're in the stage with the US Secretary of Education. The trustees were in the audience, along with faculty and students and others. And it was a very good conversation, but he asked me a question that made me stumble. And he said, well, Dean González, you're an educator. How do you teach morality? And I bumble along, a few things about the importance of, X, Y, and Z. And later on, upon reflection, I said, the answer really is deceptively simple. You teach morality by example. You can't not teach morality telling others to do things that you're not willing to embrace yourself. And so my style, my approach to modeling is to be authentic, to have empathy for others, to understand their perspectives, when I was dean at IU, I always, and it sounds trite, but I had an open door policy. Anybody, if you remember, if any of you ever been to my office, you remember I had those big doors open and, you know, as much as the office could permit, visible for anybody who walked in. And there were times when someone would walk in, a faculty member who was distressed or student who was upset for something, maybe a staff member. And if my door was open, if I wasn't in a meeting or something like that, the moment that someone walked in with or without an appointment, to me, that was the most important thing that I could be doing. And so I wanted to give that person all the attention that I could, and try to understand their concern and do what I could. So I think that idea of accessibility, of practicing what you preach, in a sense, it's a very important dimension of modeling, and it's something that I have tried to practice both in my personal and my professional life.
Before we kind of wrap up, I just want to remind folks that they can ask Emeritus Dean Gerardo González questions in the chat, and we'd be happy to pose them today. Thank you, Gerardo, for sharing your story. I think this is, it was an easy read, and especially for me, because I could relate to a lot of those things. But it was also one that really shows how important the educational system is for everyone involved, and the opportunity. I also think my life would have been so different if I was not in the United States. So I certainly understand that. And thank you very much, Farida, to putting this together. And we will open it up for Q&A from the audience. Anything you're curious about?
Yes, this is a time to ask questions, and they come in through different devices. And so I'm just going to read some of the questions that have come through my own devices. And so one of them, Dean González, as you mentioned about mentorship, and a follow-up to Vasti's question, you had an incredible experience, or an impactful experience, with Dean McDavis. And his style of mentorship. And so you and him ended up working together as dean and associate dean. And so Dean McDavis is an African-American leader, and you're a Latino leader. And so what kind of style emerged from administrative style or management style that emerged from that synergy between the two of you, and how you mentored faculty and students?
Yeah, in Rob McDavis, I actually had met Dean McDavis before he was dean, when he had just been appointed to the faculty at the University of Florida in the Department of Counselor Education. I was a student in that program, and in my memoir, I write a little bit about that. Me walking up to what was at one point the attic of the building, because the building where the houses, the College of Education, the University of Florida, was originally a laboratory school. And I found my way to his office, and I had no idea who Rob McDavis was. They just gave me a name after orientation and told me his office in such and such a place, go find him and tell him that you've been assigned to him. So I did. And I found him, as is typical, as most of you probably know, of many college universities, you assign the least desirable office to the most junior faculty. And so he's in this corner, and I walk up to him after finding the office, and I opened the door, and I walked in, and he's sitting at the desk, impeccably dressed, and looks a little startled. And I didn't know who was more shocked, he or me. Seeing him sitting there in a corner, all dressed up, and being an African-American who I had no idea was the case, and he looking at me, saying, this guy, why is he in this office, kind of thing. I mean, I don't know that those were the thought processes, but that was part of it. So our relationship really started as an advisor, and then he went on to other roles, became dean at the University of Arkansas, I believe, And then he came back to the University of Florida after I have moved into the associate dean role there. And as you know, associate deans traditionally do, you tender your resignation, give the dean a chance to put together their own team. He rejected the resignation, asked me to stay on. And what characterized, I think, our relationship was one of a strong and authentic relationship. We were both very hard workers. He, with his experiences as an African-American man in a large American, predominantly white universities in the South, and before that, you know, coming to the university, me as a non-English speaker trying to navigate the schools and ultimately the university. And I think we understood that those experiences shaped in many ways the way that we looked at the world. And so our relationship transcended just a professional relationship. We had empathy for each other, and we understood the importance of doing things in the context of a relationship. And so he ultimately went on to be provost at Virginia Commonwealth and then president of his alma mater at Ohio University in Athens. But we always stayed in touch. And in fact, I just saw him recently in Gainesville for the first time in many years. And immediately the warmth that characterized our relationship was evident. We're so happy to see each other and to just have a chance to have a conversation. And so it was typical for us to stay long after the faculty has stopped teaching and the staff had gone home, and we will both be working on whatever, but we'll stop to just kind of reminisce about the day or some issue that we were dealing with, or to talk about our kids, playing soccer together. And I think that kind of relationship taught me that good leadership, it's about relationships, and that even in a position of authority, you have to empower people to make decisions and not second guess what they would do. And so some of that mentoring that I received from Dean McDavis carried all over into my deanship, because I think those who work closely with me as associate deans and all the position of responsibility would attest that they were empowered to make decisions. And even if I would have made a different decision than they have made, if they made that decision, it was theirs, and I respected and I supported. And that's something that I learned from Dean McDavis and other good leaders that I had the good fortune of working with throughout the years.
Gerardo, we have a question that came in from our studio audience today. I'm going to play a little Oprah here. And part of the question you may not be able to answer, because I think every Cuban gets asked, how are Cuban politics playing out? So, but I think the first part of the question is a really good one. Can you make any sense of what's happening in Florida these days between the governor and higher education? And how does the large immigration population in Florida, it's not just Cuban anymore, get positioned in those conversations?
Yeah. Well, Florida has had a long history of political intertwining with education, and even before DeSantis was governor here in Florida, at the time of I wrote my memoir, I spoke to some of those relationships, and how my going to Indiana in many ways was a breath of fresh air, because I found the climate in Indiana at the time I became dean in 2000 to be so much more civil than what I had experienced here in Florida. But as you know, that changed in Indiana over the years. And again, in my memoir, I write about the issues that we confront in education, the attacks on education, and my role as a spokesperson, against what was called REPA, which was a rule that really would have, in many ways, curtail, if not eliminate, colleges of education in the state. And I think that change that I experienced in Indiana from a civil environment, supportive of education, to a much more confrontational environment has unfortunately, permeated our country. And Florida is no exception. And so you read a lot about Florida these days because, everybody's suspecting that the governor is going to be a candidate for president. He has a high profile in the national scene, and so there's special attention being paid to Florida. But you find the examples of this in Texas. You find examples of this in Louisiana. You find them, in the Northeast states in some cases. So I think it's an unfortunate reality that partisan politics, have permeated so much of our lives, and education has always been in the edge because it's a public good, and the states spend a lot of money. And in Florida, in particular, we have, as the question points out, a large influx of immigration, and so you couple education always being a lightning rod with immigration being a lightning rod, and you put it both in Florida, which have always had a climate of a lot of meddling, if you will, from people who probably shouldn't be meddling, things they don't necessarily know a lot about, and so it looks like it's worse than any place else. But the sad truth is that what's happening here in Florida and what's happening in many other places is happening much too often throughout the country. And if there's anything that I hope would change, is that ultimately we begin to put some of those partisan politics behind us and focus on the mission, because we all benefit from a good educational system. We all benefit from a sensible immigration policy. And we ought to find common ground. Now, I know that sounds idealistic, and again, in the current climate, probably a pipe dream. But I think we have to be open and receptive to different ideas, and ultimately work as best we can to find common ground.
I'll chime in here with another. Sorry, go ahead, Vasti.
No, you can go ahead and jump in. I had a slightly follow-up question.
Go ahead.
One of the things that I found is Florida has certainly been at the forefront in introducing new ideas in education through the Jeb Bush years, and certainly followed up by his brother. One of the things that I find, though, is that all these ideas have not been tested whether they improved education or not. They have just been sort of become part of the norm. How could schools of education sort of coalesce to say, do we actually know if these reforms made a difference in K through 12 education? Do you have any thoughts on that? I know that's a question without an answer, but I would love to hear your thoughts.
Well, no, I do think that schools of education have a very important role. I mean, in our traditional mission of teaching and research and service and engagement. I don't think we have to abandon those missions to be able to contribute to the conversation. And one of the most important ways that we can do that, of course, in particular major research universities, is to the research of our faculty and of course the preparation of our students who then go into the schools and teach and help prepare the next generation of students and teachers and the like. But unfortunately, beginning with both Democratic and Republican administrations in Washington, schools of education have been marginalized in many ways. And so we often find ourselves on the defensive about some of these things where we should be leading. And it's easy to get angry about that, throw our hands up in the air. But I think the best way to address the problem is to stay focused on our mission of teaching, research, and service or engagement, do it at the highest levels of quality, and get a place at the table, as they say, so that our findings, our opinions can be taken into consideration.
Rita, you had a question?
Yes, I have a question. Again, it's coming in from different places. I guess this question is sort of for both of you, if I may. I don't really, as a newcomer to this country myself, one of the things that, I'm essentially the person who came over. And so, coming over, I shared my scholarship with my own brother. And so in all those types of situations, when I tell this to my children, they looked at me, and they look at me still and say, we don't know that, right? What is that experience? Are you telling a story, Mom? And so the reason I'm sharing with you that personal story is that I'd like to ask both of you in terms of how you would describe the process, the differences or the similarities of the processes of acculturation, as your family settled here in the U.S. What were there visible differences between the stages of acculturation between you, your parents, and your siblings? Were there different stages? Were there different experiences? Were there different goals and processes of adaptation, integration, or assimilation, or what are those? For my children, it's very different. For myself, I have a different story, and so I don't know whether we can reconcile, but I just want to hear what were the differences or similarities between the stages of acculturation between you and your parents and your siblings.
Yeah, absolutely. I think acculturation is a very important phenomenon among all immigrant groups, and it's something that I think we in education really do need to pay more attention to. And I'm glad to see that many schools of education today, including IU and my alma mater at Florida and others, are putting the whole issue of diversity and inclusion front and center, including the immigrant experience. But the immigrant experience is one that cannot escape the process of acculturation. Now, all children growing up experience at some point what is called, we generally refer to as a generation gap. Parents have a certain expectation that they grew up in a certain environment, certain values, and now the children are adopting values that are more germane to the new generation, their own generation, and that creates, a gap between the values and expectations as parents often does, and those that the children bring. And whether you're an immigrant or not, you experience that, and if you're an immigrant in your home country, you experience it here. Americans do. But in the case of immigrant, you superimpose on that the acculturation process, because at the same time that young children or young adults are experiencing that generation gap, you also are experiencing a cultural gap. And so my mother in Cuba, she was a stay-at-home mother. Her values revolved around being a mother, keeping the house, tending to my father. When we came here, economic circumstances were such that she had to go to work, in the factories, whatever she could do to help contribute to the household. And they were doing this because they had a vision, an expectation for what their children would do and become if given the support and the opportunities to then pursue their own goals. And so when in my family, they began to see that those values were not extinct, that, that in fact, I was dressing differently than they were expecting, that I was keeping hours that is not what they thought, a young man at that time should be keeping. That began to create additional angst in our family. And in fact, I tell a story in my book about how that group of friends that I had during early high school years and early college all wanted to be seen as Americans. I mean, we were in many ways rejecting our culture as Cubans because we wanted to be accepted, as young people want to be accepted by their peers. And we adopt American sounding names. And some of you may or may not know that even my wife still calls me Jerry sometimes because we, I had a friend, Oscar Tomas Pedraja, it's his Spanish name. He became Tommy and Arturo became Art. And so because we wanted to look and be accepted in this new culture. So my parents in some way saw that as rejection of their own culture. And while my parents were very supportive and very caring, and their style was not one to be punitive, I could tell they were not happy with some of these behaviors that we were adopting. And in part, I think we're forced into that evolution and acculturation process because we've developed different identities. In a way, we want to celebrate and we value our original culture, but we're getting messages that's not okay, and you're different. In Cuba, I was bullied when the revolution came because of the way the revolution was viewing people who were families that were not necessarily sympathetic to their ideals. But other than that, I never felt like a minority. And so when I came to the United States, I had no idea that I was a minority. And it was only after I got here and I went into the schools and I was punished for speaking Spanish and began to get messages that you don't belong because you're not adopting all these values that I realized that, man, it's not okay to be Cuban. And so I think it's not uncommon for people like me to then try to adapt to those messages that you're getting, and it creates strife within the family. Eventually, I think the goal is to help young people who are experiencing those kind of immigrant experiences, growing pains, if you will, is become bicultural. And that happens over time. And today I feel as comfortable interacting in the Cuban culture and, dancing and doing that. And I feel quite as comfortable in an American setting or, speaking to professionals or, different language. But that was a process of growth and reflection that ultimately helped us accomplish that. And the result is that sometimes when that is not manageable, it can lead to anxiety and frustration and sometimes hostility even within the family. And we were no exception. We had to navigate that process. My sister was younger than me. She was 5 years old. So she was not experiencing the same kinds of pressures. And so I think she acculturated much more easily than someone who was already entering the teen years. And now, again, that idea of belonging was so strong. My parents were tolerant, but there were some lines that could not be crossed. One of the things that some of you may or may not know this, but in my efforts to be different and to find myself, I joined the Hare Krishnas for a while. And so I went chanting and I did, the things that Hare Krishnas did, although I never adopted the dress and the hairstyle. But I was looking for something that was missing in my life. I didn't know what it was. My father and my mother were tolerant of that, although I don't know what their conversation was like, but they were tolerant at least. But when they saw that spilling over into my sister's experience, because she started wanting to get the beads that I brought home and so forth, I crossed the line that in their culture was intolerable. And because they thought they looked at it as my wanting to impose a different religion.
Mhm.
And even though they were not religious people in the traditional sense, they had strong Christian faith. And so that led to a lot of angst. And in fact, that was one of the precipitating factors for me to want to leave the home. And actually did eventually leave because of some of those kinds of experiences. As we went through the process and grew, a relationship solidified, and now we can all look back and laugh at some of those things. But at the time, it was very stressful and very difficult to navigate. So acculturation, it's a very important process that I think all educators really need to know about, because you're going to be dealing with immigrant kids, and you need to understand that in addition to all the trials and all the challenges that young people face as they develop, if you're an immigrant, you have this added challenge to navigate around acculturation. And those who have not experienced that don't always understand it and try to get kids to, quote, assimilate, when in fact, they need to help them become bicultural.
Mhm. Mhm.
I'll add that when my family became citizens when I was 12 years old, and we were given the opportunity to change our names. And I, of course, said that I wanted to change my name because when you're 12 and you have a name like Vasti, it stands out. So my friends and I went around trying out different names, and it was a group decision for me to keep my name, which I'm glad I made that now. But it was very much this notion of trying to fit in, not being the outsider.
Mhm.
I'll also add that in my research, what I have found is that there are two pieces that are slightly different than Gerardo's case. One is there's a real gendered piece within many cultures, and for myself, you know, women were not expected to leave the home until they were married, which included going to college. So it was something that I had to navigate with my parents going through this. The other piece of this is, in my research, I found that students felt a certain guilt when they had chosen something that was more American than their culture of origin. And that guilt was around, like, am I being faithful to my culture? And so that meaning-making process of making choices between two cultures had some real difficult parts to it, of integrating who you are as a person within being part of two different cultures.
Mhm.
So it's a challenge. I'll also say that we stopped using the word assimilation and acculturation in my research and began using the word manage familial expectations. Because I think that's what many immigrants end up doing, is managing those expectations,
Mhm.
rather than thinking they're going to separate or leave or never be a part of again. So,
Mhm. Mhm.
so
And you know, and I would add this, for those of us who are able to navigate that process successfully,
mhm.
it makes us stronger. Because, you know, again, I think not only give us the ability to function effectively in different culture, but it nurtures empathy for those who have to deal with similar things. And it's not just immigrants that experience that sort of dual consciousness, as Du Bois would have said, you know, because, you know, you see yourself as an American, you're born here, if you're a person of color, but the country saying, but you don't belong. And so you have to navigate this identity with the messages that you're getting. And at the end of the day, I think that it makes us stronger, more resilient, but it is a difficult process to navigate.
Mhm. I just remember a line from the recent conference that we had this weekend. The phrase was, "You are wanted but not welcomed." You know, that was a line that you know I came away from that conference, and there are many things, other things that we could continue to talk about, because there are many who share your experiences and want to explore how both of you and Dean González, through your book, how you've navigated those very complicated pathways. And so within the few minutes that we have, what are the things that we did not talk about that you really want us to come away with, to think about some more? Those are things that have been impactful, that's meaningful, but that you want to articulate, but it has not had have had the opportunity to do so through your book or through elsewhere.
I mean, there's so much to say about the importance of education, and the title of my book, the subtitle of it is not just a Cuban refugee journey to the American dream, but the subtitle is The Power of Education. And education is transformation and generation. So all my children now, I have 4 children, are educated. The children are much more likely to be educated because I was able to get an education that then became a generational influence. And so, since we are amongst a group of educators, I just want to say, don't underestimate that power that you have to influence a life that can influence a community, can influence a country, and ultimately influence the world. And the kind of world that we live in is becoming increasingly diverse and mobile. That understanding becomes a critical factor, a critical element in having impact.
Well, with that, thank you so much for being in this webinar. Thank you, Dean González, and thank you, Vasti, for engaging us in thinking some more about this very issue. Thank you so much. And the memoir is up on the archives through the memoir are up online that you can access through this webinar.
My pleasure. And I just want to point out, Farida, you mentioned the archives. I donated the original documents are referenced in my memoir, the original telegram giving of permission to leave Cuba, my original Cuban passport, a lot of family artifacts that are important and central to the book, to the University of Florida archives. And those are available for inspection physically or digitally. And so I would encourage anyone interested to check that out and see what's there and see some way might somehow tied to your interests as an educator or researcher or whatever.
Thank you again, Dean González, and thank you again, Dean Torres. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful afternoon, everybody.
Great to see you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.